Welcome to episode 4 of the Stygion and Stanley podcast. I'm Danny Stygion.
JD.
The two movies we're going to be talking about in this episode are The Empty Man, which came out in 2020 during the pandemic, and Kaidan, which is a Japanese horror film that came out like 60 years ago.
Yeah.
1964, or 61 years ago. And first up is The Empty Man. I forgot if I read about this or I had heard about this movie because of David Fincher. The director of this movie, his name is David Pryor, and I guess he was kind of like a protege of David Fincher. Like he got in the business, I think, from designing like DVD menus and cases, like when DVDs are like kind of the big deal. Blu-rays hadn't came out. He designed the Fight Club DVD set, which looked like it was packaged. And I just remember that menu and everything was like very different from all other like DVD menus. It was like super intricate and interesting. And then he started doing behind the scenes documentaries for David Fincher. And this was his first movie. I think when I first heard about it, though, before I knew all this, I kind of disregarded the movie because when I heard the title of The Empty Man, I just thought, oh, the Slender Man or the Bye Bye Man. It's just probably one of those like zero budget, bad horror movies.
But it's kind of how it started, right? That's when I was watching it, it wasn't low budget. But
Yeah.
when I went into it and they were, the thing happened with the kids, and I was like, oh, this is another one of those Slender Man or Bye Bye Man or all the other ones that I can't even think of right now. I was like, oh, this is just one of those. And I'm like, those are cool, I've never seen anything with the Slender Man, but I thought that's where it was going, and then it kind of like
it becomes a hard
left. Yeah, and I was like, oh, okay.
It becomes kind of like a 70s like paranoia movie, which like I love those movies, like The Parallax View and All the President's Men, like those movies that came out in the 70s. It definitely gave me that type of vibe. And what do you think of the opening, which is like 22 minutes before the title even shows up?
So it was a little confusing because I was like, oh, is this whole movie is going to take place? What I assumed was out in wherever they were at, someplace in Asia, way up on a mountain.
Yeah.
And I thought like, oh, this is interesting. And I was, again, from what I thought it was going to be, just I didn't read any synopsis for it. If I haven't seen the movie, I try to just go into it like, as blank as possible. So they have like that whole scene plays out, and it's not very foreboding at first. There's not like a lot of that bridge was fucked up. I would never walk on a bridge like that.
Yeah.
But it was interesting the way they did it, and I didn't see any of it coming. So it was not, they weren't laying the groundwork on too thick. When the deaths happened one after the other, it just kind of, I was like, oh, where are they going with this? And then all of a sudden it completely transitions, like almost like that could have been used as the trailer for the whole film.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of cool. And then the whole kind of like changing gears to being like, you almost thought it was going to be a movie with a bunch of teens.
Yeah.
Right. And I was like, oh, a teen slasher. I'm like, all right. And then it kept transitioning like, nope, just kidding. It's not a teen slasher. And then like, oh, just kidding. It's not a slasher at all. It's an occult movie. And then you're like, oh, just kidding. It's not an occult movie. It's like surreal, almost like a paranormal. And I liked that it just kept like changing gears. That was fun.
Yeah, that's one of the things I definitely liked about it. Like when I first saw it, I really didn't know where it was going. And then after the first viewing, you begin to see like things like just like for bridges, for example. there's the bridge at the beginning, there's the bridge with the teens, and then I think the very first shot of the main character, the uh, James Badge Dale, I think is the actor's name. Like he's running on a bridge, and then that cult that he's investigating, I think that word, I think Pontifex. I have to look it up again, but that literally means, I think, bridge. So I like movies like that have a bunch of little layers and stuff that you can go back and watch and pick up all the Easter eggs.
Yeah.
And that back to that opening, that skeleton in that cave, that was super creepy and like Geiger-esque.
Yeah. Yeah, that was it was strange that they didn't like revisit that. Like they didn't explain more about what that was and why it was there. I don't think it was super important. I think it was just there to make the cave creepy while the guy's in a catatonic kind of state. But I really appreciated the odd pacing of the whole movie.
Yeah.
It didn't have that, kind of copy and paste that some of the horror movies have.
It doesn't seem rushed. I don't know how you feel. Like it seemed like it took its time.
Oh yeah, like some of the movies, I talk about this a lot when I watch them. Horror movies, maybe more specifically. I feel like they started making a movie, and I don't know if they ran out of money or they just never, or they started filming before they had a cohesive story. The ending sometimes just fuck off the whole movie.
Yeah.
Low budget, high budget, it doesn't matter. Some of these movies, like the whole thing starts out great, the middles, whatever, and then the ending just is like I don't know. I wouldn't even call it premature ejaculation. I would call it like full on, just limp dick movie. It's fucking awful. And that pisses me off more than anything else. I'm like, man, did they really write this way?
Yeah.
So I do appreciate when a movie feels like, oh, they had a beginning, middle, and end that they stuck with. This movie definitely feels like everything was planned out. And I guess you said it came out during the pandemic, which is before or after the pandemic. They could have survived going straight to streaming.
Yeah.
But I think during that time, right before that time and right around that time, movies still had to have theatrical releases to do well.
So I read that, so they filmed this movie in 2016, 2017, but for some reason the release got held up to 2020, and everything was crazy at that time. Also, Fox produced this, 20th Century Fox, and it was one of the last releases before Disney bought them. So this movie kind of got lost in that shuffle. So they literally, I think they only put it out in theaters for 1 week before they pulled it, and they never put it out on DVD or Blu-ray. So it's only available on streaming. So this movie and the director kind of got screwed, I think. That's why not many people have heard about it. And so when you said obscure, it's like, oh, empty, man. I don't think that many people have heard about this movie.
Just kind of got lost in the mix. I feel like that with Knights of Badassdom.
Oh yeah, I like that movie.
That movie got.
I think you told me about it.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I like that movie a lot. And I think that's kind of what's happening with the Toxic Avenger, right? The remake. That's stuck in a weird. Maybe they're going to release it. Maybe they're not. Limbo. I think it's been finished for several years now.
Huh. Yeah, I don't know much about the remake. I remember the one from my childhood.
Yeah, right. So yeah, they've remade it. It's got Peter Dinklage in it and Elijah Wood.
Oh, nice.
Notable actors, and it's completely finished. People have seen it, but there's no way for us to see it.
I wonder why. I wonder if it's a distribution thing or the content. I don't know.
I don't think it's content. I think it's something to do with just probably some bullshit that is, nothing on the level.
Producer politics.
For sure. Money. One of those things. I even have this guy I know that pirates movies, and he's having a really hard time finding it too. So.
Oh yeah.
He's been looking for a while. There's just no copies out there, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'll have to read up on that the issues with the release. So yeah.
But I think that happened to a movie with Dan Fogler a few years ago. A Star Wars like movie where these guys are trying to take their friend who's dying of cancer to see.
Fanboys, I think.
Yeah. Fanboys was like that. It didn't get released for several years, after it was done. So I know none of those are horror movies. I'm sure it happens with horror movies as well.
Yeah, for sure. One of my favorite scenes in the Empty Man was when he's in the woods, or he goes out to those cabins, and he walks through the woods, and then he sees all the cult members in the distance, and they're all kind of like synchronized. I feel like that's one of the best moments I've seen in a horror film, when they just kind of all stare at him. And I love the line where he's like, "Oh, fuck this." It's like, we're always thinking that, but the characters never say it. But here he is like, "Yeah, let me get the fuck out of here."
One of the things that pisses me off in a lot of horror movies is that every character in the movie acts like they've never seen a horror movie, or like horror movies don't exist. Yeah. And that's always pissed me off. Like, oh, we call them walkers. We call them infected. They're motherfucking zombies. Yeah. Everyone has seen a zombie movie. Everyone knows who the fuck, created the genre. Everyone knows where it came from. Same thing with vampires. Like in older, I guess, movies, or movies set in like the past, it seems a little more plausible. But any movie set in modern times where they act like they've never seen a horror movie, and they're explaining you have to shoot him in the head, and they're like, what? In the head? Like I think it's insulting to watch a horror movie like that. And that one, when he was like, oh fuck this, is perfect. Yeah. Not that he acknowledged that there's other horror movies out there, but he didn't do that typical like, oh, what's going on over here? Let me go look. Let me get a closer look.
His character had intelligence, and you rarely see that in like horror films, because like they're always just trying to get the plot to the next point. So I love movies that like have smart people in them. Or like, oh, I know I'm the first guy that's supposed to die in this movie, but I'm not going in there.
Well, even like everyone stopping to look at him, it's very subtle, but it gives you that kind of like that uneasy feeling, because the behavior is not normal. Yeah. Right. It's not like they turned and one of them pointed at him and was like, oh, there he is, or anything like that. It was just that kind of creepy reaction. There is a horror video game from several years ago called Dying Light. There's a sequel also, but the first one, when the sun started setting and it's like low in the sky where it's really intense light, all the zombies in the game stopped and they were just staring at the sun as it's going down. And then like once the sun goes down, all the zombies become way more powerful, and like these different types of zombies come out and start hunting you. But it was really creepy just to see that, like, you're running along this, destroyed city, and then all of a sudden you just see all the zombies. They're not moving at all. They're just staring at the sun setting. It's really like kind of a subtle creepiness to it. So, but yeah, that scene was really good, and really, I guess, kind of made him more believable as a protagonist. Like that, oh fuck this, and he's like, I'm realizing that there's no reason to stay around and try to figure out what's going on.
I don't think there's any like jump scare moments in the movie. Like they kind of just went more for like dread or like creepy atmosphere.
Yeah, I guess the only even slight jump scare is at that very beginning when you first see that skull, when it's all dark and they shine the flashlight on it. Yeah. That's the only one that I can remember that is even slightly like a jump scare. They just present this, flashlight looking around, and I guess maybe a couple of scenes where they actually kind of out of the corner of their eye or whatever see the Empty Man are a little unsettling, but nothing like the traditional like jump scare like you were saying.
I think the Empty Man or the cloak thing, like that was pretty effective how they did that.
Yeah, I appreciated it. It was, you know, separating itself from the riffraff.
I'm surprised that the producers put up, because this looks like an expensive movie, that they put up this amount of money for a movie like this, with with a non-traditional plot. And I mean, it's 20th Century Fox, not like an indie studio. So I'm glad they did.
Yeah, I think probably there's, I don't want to say like they've got dirt on people, but I guess it's just connections, right? You meet the right person and you're like, "Oh, this guy's cool." The the settings were really interesting too. It wasn't like your typical like they always have a house that looks almost exactly the same in all of these horror movies, and they have like
Yeah,
certain locations they seem to get stuck in. Like, and I feel like that's probably higher up people, that are involved in the movie that don't actually have any artistic interest in the movie, but they don't want to do anything out of the ordinary. They're just like, "Oh no, let's film it here. Let's do this shot. Let's do this shot." And it gets boring sometimes.
yeah.
And I don't think that's any fault of like the directors or I think it's probably higher up. But this movie, again, for being not an indie film, they seem to kind of have free reign of how they wanted to shoot it and what they wanted to do.
Well, I hope the director gets another chance to make like another feature film, because I think this is the only one he's done so far. And it definitely felt like a Fincher movie at times too. Just like the cinematography and camera movements and stuff.
Yeah, maybe it'll get a like a cult following and get popular like some movies do
Yeah.
through streaming.
And so the second movie we're going to talk about is Kaidan. Take the lead on that.
Oh, yeah. So I think it translates directly to Ghost Story. I guess it's an anthology film. It's a bunch of like short movies. None of them really have anything to do with one another. All of them just ghost stories. I watched first time I saw the movie. I think I was maybe 6. Watched it with my grandmother, and I remember like it was the first color. We watched a lot of old Japanese movies, and it was the first one in color I remember watching with her. And I didn't speak Japanese well enough to understand what they were saying for the most part, although it is like an older form of Japanese they're speaking, more like my grandmother's. So she would kind of walk me through what they were saying as we were watching the movies, because I couldn't keep up. Although the dialogue in the movie is very slow and even like a narration at certain points, so it wasn't too difficult. But I remember even back then, like thinking the color was interesting. The red is in the first little mini film with like I knew something like, oh, why is that important? Why is that dress red? Like, why is that such an important? Everything is so washed out and everything is so muted, and then there's this red dress, and I was like, oh, that's got to be important, right? So, I always appreciate use of color in any movie, any film.
Yeah.
And in, I guess, a lot of Japanese culture, colors kind of equate to feelings. So, like, certain colors represent certain things. Red often is associated with death, as opposed to like love in American culture. Like, think red, you're like, oh, it's Valentine's Day, let's have red everywhere.
Yeah.
But in those cases, the colors were used very interesting. The way they changed the lighting, it kind of like the old like Lon Chaney films where they show him transitioning into a creature, and they do like different lighting from different angles, and it would like the shadow would shift, and then all of a sudden he's this whole different creature. So it felt like that a lot. And of course, if you watch lots of like Japanese horror, there's a bunch of good stuff. You can right away see like the way they make someone really pale. Like you already know something, so there's some kind of fuckery going on. Like it was in indicators just from different watching different horror films. And then it was almost like they were all filmed like a play, right? Like the closed set. And I'm sure that was intentional. I think they probably hadn't fully embraced Western style of shooting movies in, the 60s. So
When you told me this was your pick, like I had heard of the movie title before, like when I had seen it on lists for Japanese horror films, but had never gotten around to watching it. So I went in blind. I watched it this morning, and man, I really loved this movie. Like the set design, the cinematography. I watched it on HBO Max, and I guess the transfer was made by Criterion, because it said Criterion when it started. And man, I can't believe this movie was 60 years, or was filmed and released 60 years ago. Like it looks so like crisp, the cinematography, and I just really love the atmosphere. I think, and I love the segments kind of in order, like the first one and the second one, and then the third and fourth. Like the first two really blew me away, and the first one is like really kind of sad too. Like like just those, you really feel the feelings of regret. Like, oh, I got to get back to this woman that I wronged, and but yeah, just, and the set, like you mentioned the color, like I really love the colors, and even though the sets, like when they're walking around, the landscapes are like, I don't know what, if they're like paintings or what, but you can see like eyes in the background, like in the clouds.
Oh yeah.
I thought that was like really artistic and cool. Honestly, don't know if I've seen a movie like this before. Like Japanese horror. I have a bunch more to watch, but it's like, man, this is like all new to me. And,
it's very much like theater, like modified theater sets. And there's a lot of them like that, where it's very clear that they were filmed like on a lot somewhere.
Yeah.
But it's strange because I feel like a lot of the movies, like you were saying, how crisp it looks, even though it's really old. There's a lot of movies like that. Even a lot of the Kurosawa stuff.
Yeah.
Like to realize how old it is, and like, man, it's really like
sharp,
crystal clear. Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of it is that it's been remastered. They may took care of it, the film, really well. Criterion does a whole lot of those movies over and probably, fixed up. But yeah, the style of the background, I think, is meant to just not be important. Everything is so focused on the facial expressions.
Yeah.
Are really important. That movie, it's not super scary for a horror movie, but when I was 6 years old, that movie fucking horrified me. All of those movies used to horrify me as a kid, and then my grandmother would tell me these stories that would also further horrify me. Of like, these like angry, I guess the translation would be witches, but they were like angry spirits of women who turned into like giant spiders and goblins and hid under bridges, and like I was fucking horrified all the time. And then she'd tell me this story, and she's like, okay, I gotta go wash my hands, and I gotta walk through her her like sitting room of like Oni masks and shit all covering the walls.
Yeah.
It was like horrifying. And that, I guess that's part of why that movie is one that I thought right away when we were talking about something obscure. I thought, oh, I don't think a lot of people watch this film outside of people who are interested in Japanese cinema, period. But as far as horror films, I don't hear people talk about Japanese horror films, especially the older ones. They talk about
it's The Grudge, yeah,
that kind of stuff. And but the older stuff, I think, is scary also, just maybe not as adults.
I do have a Japanese, my own personal experience with a Japanese ghost story. Like I don't get to talk about it much. So I was going to tell you. I don't know if I have told you before. Um, so when I was a kid, uh, maybe when I was like 5 or 6, we used to live on a military base in Japan, and it was like this tall building, or the military base had a bunch of tall buildings where I guess almost like apartment buildings that everyone lived on, and we were pretty high up in the building. I don't remember the floor anymore. It was so long ago, but and nothing crazy happened. I just remember like one day I was like playing in the living room. I think I was playing with like my He-Man toys or whatever. My dad was in the shower, and just for like a few seconds, I saw an old Japanese man just kind of float behind the couch, and it only lasted a few seconds. And at the time, I didn't think much of it. I'm just a kid, like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I think I maybe told my dad. Like, I don't remember what happened after, but I just know that I saw it. Like, there wasn't like hallucination or you took some chemicals or you drank some. No, like I saw what I saw. Like, I believe what I saw.
Right.
I don't know what it means. Because I've only had 2 experiences like that in my whole life that like made me think, there's something more. And I had brought this up to my mom like years later, I think like 20 years later, like, hey, did you ever see anything funny in that apartment that we lived in? And she said, yeah, there was a ghost that used to like try to attack her and my aunt. I guess apparently try to rape my aunt or something crazy like that. And
Yes.
that was kind of like validation for me. Like, oh, so like what I saw wasn't just me. Like other people saw that shit. And but yeah, I hate to say it, but it's so cliche. It was literally just a faint, white, just old Japanese man with a long beard just floating, like they always say, like, ghosts look white. That's basically what I saw.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I still remember that. Like I can't remember much from my childhood, but that's still a pretty, crisp memory for me.
A core memory. Yeah.
Yeah.
That seems to be, I guess, being in tune with ghosts seems to be very just commonplace in Japanese culture and lore and things. I've read stories about people seeing ghosts after the tsunami from a few years ago. And it's always someone who's like soaking wet will show up at their door looking for someone, and they'll like, oh, well, let me go get you a towel, or let me go get you, something warm to eat. And they'll come back and there will be no one there, just a puddle from where the person was standing. And I guess, if you consolidate as much history as Japan has into like a small group of islands, think about the history that this continent has, but it's so spread out. If ghosts were going to be somewhere, it would make sense that they can't, they can't spread out very much. It's on a small island.
Yeah.
So I like the concept of it. I've never seen something personally that my brain didn't ruin for me, I guess. Like my brain very analytical and is looking for
Like
logic.
working it out, logic. Yeah.
Yeah, and it does that all the time. And so I've never seen anything that I couldn't just, dismiss.
Yeah.
I would like to. I've stayed the night in haunted prisons that were, decommissioned or whatever. So I've put myself in positions to see this stuff often, but just haven't yet. And maybe it's because I'm so skeptical of things to begin with. But
I also wonder too, it's like maybe I was able to see it because I was a kid and I hadn't all these ideas shoved down my throat yet.
Yeah, that's possible.
But then again, my mother and aunt claim they saw something too, so who knows? I I did want to ask you though, like I know Japanese people are culture, they believe in ghosts. I mean, obviously. Um, but like what do they believe? Because you're half Japanese, right?
Mhm.
What are the spiritual beliefs of Japanese people?
It just
Because I
depends,
honestly don't know.
because Japan, unfortunately, like most of the world, has been infected by the cancerous Christianity. So a lot of people um, lost their culture, they lost their beliefs, they lost their true religion, and they just buy into this, Christian bullshit like so many others. It so I think it muddled it, right? It changes all these beliefs. Um, there are still like people that don't follow that, which I love that part of Japan. Um, believing that everything has a spirit, and I guess that spirits are just around in general, um, is pretty common. And obviously, like, death is just viewed differently. It's strange. I'm sure you've read and heard about like the suicide forest.
Yeah,
Uh,
that story is
suicide,
like really interesting to me.
yeah, suicide has a way different, like, I don't know. It's like a different way of looking at it than here. This country is so fucking, you know,
You're going to be
butt fucked by
punished.
Christianity that, yeah,
Yeah.
people just assume like, oh, suicide's bad, suicide's bad.
You're going to go to
And they
hell. Yeah.
they do this thing where like, oh, I can't believe she killed herself. That's so sad. But I think like the idea in Japan, if like someone killed themselves, for example, throwing themselves in front of a train, that would be dishonorable, and it would be dishonorable because you made people late. Your death impacted other people negatively. So they go out to this forest because they're not inconveniencing anybody. That makes sense.
Do they believe?
That
So they don't believe like they're going to be punished, kind of like
Nope,
Christians do.
no. It's there's no like punishment for the way you ended your life unless you've done it in a way that inconveniences other people.
Oh wow.
So they don't kill themselves in their apartments. They don't kill themselves in public where it's like a very private, personal thing. Um,
Is
and
seppuku the samurai way of committing? Was that an honorable thing?
yes, it was honorable and almost like expected. That was the only way you could retain face, even if you did nothing. Some people have this idea like samurai were these like just badass warriors. Samurai were servants. That's what it means. They were there like to serve this lord. And
Yeah,
so
for
if he was dishonored in some way, they were expected to, open their bellies up and die honorably. And if they didn't, they were kind of cast out from society. Um, but again, just suicide in general there has, not the same connotations. And death is the same way. It's like an epidemic of sorts in Japan where old people die and they don't get visited by relatives. They live way out, somewhere remote, and they die in their houses, and sometimes they're not found for months. And they go and finally check on some of these old people, and they've died in their house
wow.
because just of old age. But I don't think there's the same like concept of like, oh, this place is going to be haunted now because this old lady died alone in this house. Um, I could be wrong, but it just doesn't seem like that's much of a thought. Whereas here, people think, even Christian people will, oh, it must be haunted, or oh, that's scary. They think cemeteries are scary. They think death is like scary because I'm assuming because of their belief system. Um, and then like I guess in the horror movies too, the same way they do it, like the lady, for example, who his wife he left, and she died basically of a broken heart, right? He left her and she just died of despair. The ghost was not a danger to anyone except for him.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like she was angry and haunting. He just saw what happened, and it, like, aged him considerably. Like instantly, his hair turned white, and even the same thing with the lady. I don't even know what they designated her as, who became his wife after she made that deal with him. Like, oh, I'm not going to kill you as long as you never tell anyone about me. That horrified me as a kid because
I didn't realize at first that was the same person, or the ghost was the same woman that he ends up marrying until like a little bit later into the story. So
yeah, crazy, right? That she just decided to like be a mother and everything. That one scared me. And then like when he put her shoes outside and then they were missing. That scene very specifically, I remember being very afraid of it. Like, she came back and took her shoes, and having to like take your shoes off outside of my grandma's house and then like put on slippers inside the house. I was always afraid when we were going back outside that my shoes were going to be gone. And I just associated that with, if my shoes were gone, an angry ghost took them and it's going to come back to kill me. And I knew, as a little kid, that's every time we opened the door, I was like, my shoes aren't there, I'm going to lose my shit.
Yeah.
I remember that being a very distinct fear as a child. Like, they're going to take my shoes, and that's going to be like somehow like warning that I'm going to die soon. So some of those scenes, I'm sure, were like led me to believe that there was nothing in that movie as an adult watching it. I'm like, oh, she just took her shoes that he gave her. But as a kid watching that, I thought, oh, if a ghost takes your shoes, it means you're going to die. So it was just a very strange way to think about it as a kid. But all of the ghosts in the story, they just kind of hung around, and they always have deals, right? So that's an interesting change from like American style ghosts, who are just angry, right? The ghosts in American movies are just like horrifying, spirits that have been wronged, like 13 Ghosts, which is a super underrated film.
Oh yeah, me and Brittany love that movie.
But they all had something terrible happen to them. And I guess in the Japanese movies, they didn't necessarily have something bad happen to them. But they have all these like little deals and things they like to do, and tricks. And the kid who was telling the story, essentially he was a bard, telling the story of the battle to the ghost court. It's like they couldn't just take him outright. There had to be like steps to it. They follow these very strict rules.
Yeah.
It makes me think of like Western culture's vampires, right? You have to invite them in, they've all got these weird, there used to be one, I think, with vampires with like counting things or knots, different versions of it, right? Where they have to count things on the ground, or they have to untie knots if they see them. Just really strange things. And I wonder sometimes, like, if those stories were taken from like different Eastern cultures. I don't know a lot about like Chinese ghost stories or, Vietnamese ghost stories. I don't know any of the other Korean ghost stories, but I'm assuming they're going to be similar with like almost like a script they have to follow as beings.
Did movies like The Ring and The Grudge or Ringu, I guess the symbol or the character of the Japanese woman with the long black hair, is that like an old myth or in Japanese culture?
In a lot of the I think a lot of the stories came from like peasants and I think that's just how they wore their hair. They keep it, pulled up, but just having long hair was just part of the history. And then the way they depicted them in paintings, I think probably played a role, because they didn't change faces in like the wood blocks and the paintings.
Yeah.
Everyone looked the same essentially. The difference was what they were wearing and how their hair was worn. So I don't know if that played a part in it, because they do like always have like the long,
Japanese woman with the long black hair. Yeah.
yeah. And I think it's just probably the hairstyle from the time when most of those stories came about.
Yeah.
But they're all similar to that. Like they all have that same peasant beginning. Like they were the poor. You don't see a lot of ghost stories that involve like an empress or a woman who had any kind of standing. It's always like,
oh yeah,
the poor peasant that was
wronged,
treated wrongly, or heartbroken. I think that's probably where most of it comes from. Plus, everything is like flowing, right? Like in all the ghosts, yeah, the way the apparitions move, and I think maybe long hair just kind of
helps with that.
Yeah, maybe there could be more meaning to it than that, but not that I know of.
Another thing I really liked about it, especially the first segment, is it had really high tilted, like odd angles. That's something that really struck out to me. It's just like the style of the film, because like I pay a lot of attention to compositions just because of my photography, and I was like really impressed with the cinematography.
Yeah, when I picked it, I hadn't seen that movie in several years, but when I was rewatching it, I was curious. I was like, I wonder what Danny thinks of this scene right here.
Yeah.
I'm obviously not a photographer, but I always appreciate just weird angles of anything. When they paint artwork a certain way, or when anything that's done, I always like that. So I don't know if it's compositionally correct, but it's definitely something that'll catch your eye. And sometimes in that movie, while you're watching it, even like I would catch myself like tilting my head with.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know if that's by intention, or by design, but I appreciate it.
I haven't had enough time to like absorb the whole movie or digest it yet. But what does the last segment like mean to you? I guess with the writer and the publisher,
where they just ended it.
Yeah, like the meaning. What do you think it means? What are they trying to say?
I think it was just it made me think of, again, I would come back to this a lot, Twilight Zone. And how sometimes they would end Twilight Zone episodes like that, like breaking the fourth wall, so to speak.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's kind of what it was. It was just like, before they even coined that term, I think that's what it was. It was like a fourth wall break.
Like open-ended, ambiguous.
Yeah, like you tell the
out.
end of the story. Like,
yeah,
because ghost stories, are passed down, and I'm pretty sure that all these ghost stories were written long before. They weren't something that the director or the writer came up with on their own. I think they were just old ghost stories that they decided to put into this new art medium. So I think that's what it was. It was a fourth wall break, kind of like, oh, and now you finish the story, and now you tell the story.
Yeah. I think this is definitely, it's like, I almost feel like this is like a perfect movie. Like it's going to be high on my list of Japanese horror now, from now on.
Yeah, I believe it won a bunch of awards when it came out. Obviously, years and years, decades before I was born, but it always stuck with me. Even the first time I ever watched it as a young kid, just it's such a striking visually, that even though I couldn't tell exactly what was going on in all of the different like mini films,
yeah,
it just really stuck with me. And then every time I've seen it over the years, it's the same thing. I'm like, man, that was, like you were saying, digesting. It almost feels like, wow, those are interesting, and then you're like trying to like find symbolism, and I think that's maybe the point of the way they ended it, is
Yeah.
knowing that like, oh, this stuff was all done very intentionally. Like, you finish the story, you tell the story. So I think that was definitely intentional, and I think that was what it was, is the fourth wall break without the fourth wall break, which I know Twilight Zone came out after that film, but I like to think that maybe they were inspired by some of that stuff, right? And they're like, oh, let's do a little fourth wall break here.
Yeah.
And that little bit of a cliffhanger, kind of not necessarily a real cliffhanger, but just like credits come up and you can't even process. You're like, wait, what? And it's like, so again, I appreciate that.
Another thing I noticed they did was some scenes, there was no sound. Like, there's action on the screen, but it was just the score, the Japanese style music, and I thought that was pretty effective. Like the way they did that, especially those battle scenes. The one with they're explaining those battles before the blind man segment. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a lot of theater. I've not seen obviously a lot of like the kabuki style theater plays, but the ones I have seen, that silence is sometimes super intentional. There are certain segments in some of the plays I've seen where there'll be no sound, and even the way they move across the stage, they're wearing like socks, and they'll be shuffling their feet very slightly as they're moving, and just no sound at all. And then all of a sudden, like, there'll be a big calamity that'll happen.
Yeah.
And obviously, definitely, like, it's meant to really take out any other sensory, so that like your eyes are focused on something. They want you to watch something very subtle.
It's hard to pull off. Like, I thought about it. Like, I don't know many modern movies that could like pull it off.
Yeah, I mean, I bet they could. It would just take, planning. It'd be interesting to like put that into a movie with just that complete silence, and almost to the point of where it would make people think there's something wrong with the audio, right?
Yeah.
Like, modern movies don't do that. So if you were watching a movie and all of a sudden it gets super silent, you'd have people turning up the audio. And then to bring the audio back in really intensely, it could definitely be interesting. Fucking with people.
I love that instrument that he plays in the third segment. Like, I remember, I think, doesn't Donnie Yen play the same thing in Hero or something like that in that fight scene?
Similar instrument, but different. Yeah, I like that. I like the way it's played. It's something I would love to have.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't have any musical talent at all, but if I did, it would be fun to like sit outside and play that, bother everybody, as an just being an older Asian man just sitting outside playing a shamisen or a bisu, just plucking away, telling stories.
I remember there was one martial arts movie I watched that had like the guy playing the flute. So I ordered a flute because I thought he was badass, and it's like, I gotta say, I can't play the fucking flute. Just threw it away.
That's it's pretty funny. Yeah, I don't know. I've always been pretty. I acknowledge that I have no musical ability, so
I am right there with you. One thing I think it'd be interesting to do on a future episode is to compare the Japanese original version of a horror film like Ringu and then like the American version, because a bunch of those came out like I think the early 2000s. The Grudge, Dark Water, Pulse.
Yeah. There's a lot of directors that have ripped off Japanese cinema.
Yeah.
There's a fucking piece of shit named Quentin Tarantino that did it, and I fucking hate that guy. They're not horror movies, but Kill Bill Volume 1 and 2 are almost frame for frame, almost verbatim ripoffs of Lady Snowblood.
Oh yeah, I remember you were telling me of that. Yeah.
Which, when I first showed those to my wife, she got angry while we were watching them. She was like, "This is the exact same shot, the same framing."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Yeah, like he ripped off this movie." And I guess if he would just own up to it, but he never has. He's, "Oh, I'm just inspired." No, bitch, you weren't inspired. You fucking ripped it off. With The Ring and Dark Water and things like that, I feel like they were more transparent that these were Americanized remakes.
Some of them are good. Like I enjoyed the remakes, but except for Pulse, that's pretty terrible.
Yeah. The thing that bothers me, I guess, is that I don't understand the need for a remake. Like, dub it into English, and there's no reason to remake it as far as I'm concerned. But I guess, they don't think people are going to be able to relate if there's an Asian on the screen rather than a white person. But I don't think those movies needed to be remade. I think they just you could have done a good job dubbing them into English, and I think it would have been fine.
I think Hero, Jet Li, I think that was one of the first ones. Like they kind of did that, where like the movie is good as is, let's not try to remake it. Let's just play it. I think it did pretty. I remember going to see that twice in the theaters.
Yeah, I guess with action movies, it's maybe like a little different. They expect martial arts movies and action movies to have, Asian leads, and it's not as much of a deal. I think it's changing because with the internet and everyone being connected, I think Ringu got more attention like later on, and more people seem to watch that one and know that one just as well as The Ring.
Yeah.
And realize like, oh man, this was great. This was scary as shit. Like, why did they do a remake? And the only character that's still Asian is the ghost.
Yeah, I don't understand that. The Japanese version of Pulse, like I remember seeing that last year. That was really good. I think that's one of my favorite.
It's for sure better than the remake one. And I guess it's just I don't know. I don't have that same, I guess, viewpoint. I've never not been, Asian, half, but still.
Yeah.
So I don't have that concept. And I was, American enough that I didn't ever watch like, an American action movie and go like, oh, why is this guy white? It wasn't like a situation like that to me, but I've never been uncomfortable with watching Asian movies, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, in the native language and reading subtitles. It's never been like an issue to me. Yeah. The cultures aren't like confusing to me, so maybe I don't have the best viewpoint of understanding why they remade those.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, I feel like American audiences would have loved Ringu. Like, if they watched it, they would have been like, "Oh, this is great." Sure wish there were white people in this movie. I don't know that they would, I can't imagine that would be the sentiment, but I mean, maybe it would. I do get bothered when I see like Asian characters being replaced by, white characters. I'm like, why? Why do they do that?
I guess if they're, I guess I see your point. Like, if they're going to just do an American version of one of those films, then just replace the whole cast, not still leave the Japanese woman in. Like,
Yeah,
'cause I guess they did that.
Odd. Yeah, that seemed a little odd. But I guess, like, I don't know. I just didn't understand why those movies weren't old.
Yeah.
So I feel like they just could have dubbed them into English, and that would have been enough. But maybe not. That's why I don't have that viewpoint of being, just a straight 100% Caucasian American, or they can they don't have any concept of Asian culture. So I guess, maybe that was necessary. Maybe they did like a focus group. But
did the director of Kaidan, I think his name is Kobayashi, has he directed anything that was similar to Kaidan, or anything that I should check out in his filmography?
I'm really bad about knowing who directed some of these movies outside of, like Kurosawa obviously had a very distinctive style.
Yeah.
There are lots of Japanese horror movies that all kind of fit in the same time period. Some of them probably even from the same year, that are fantastic. And obviously I can give you a list of those at some point to watch.
Yeah, I'm definitely want to watch more. Like,
they horrified me as a kid, and it's funny to watch them now again. Feel like I spent a huge part of my before I became 10 watching all these horror movies and just being scared all the fucking time. But some of the stuff I watch, I don't understand why I was so afraid, and then some of the stuff I watch, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember the exact feeling when I was rewatching Kaidan the other day. I was like, oh shit, when it showed when he turned over her hair, her body, and you could see the skeleton. I was like, oh shit, I remember just being completely horrified by that scene, and I remembered the horrible feeling I had. I had this nightmare from when I was a kid that I woke up screaming, and I feel like it has almost directly to do with that film. So,
oh yeah. I definitely, yeah. I want that list. I want to see if there's anything that's kind of similar came out.
A lot of them are on Max too. So.
Oh, awesome.
So that's, if someone has that channel, that's cool. Although I would also suggest everyone learn to pirate movies, because fuck these goddamn bastards.